Good evening. My name is Annie Machon, and I'm part of the organising team for the World Ethical Data Forum, which is going to be held on the 17th to the 19th of March this year. Part of its work involves campaigning around privacy, and it has an outreach campaign called Privacy to Me. And as part of the run-up to the forum, we are going to be interviewing and having fireside chats with some of our speakers to investigate some of the issues that we will be looking at during the forum. So welcome tonight, and also welcome to our first speaker, who's called Silkie Carlo, who runs the Big Brother Watch in the UK. So welcome, Silkie, and thank you for participating in this.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to see you again. Silkie and I are old friends, or rather, I should say I'm old and she's been a friend for a decade. So that's probably a more accurate description. And both of us have worked quite extensively looking at the issue of privacy, looking at the issue of whistleblowers, looking at the issues of free media, and also civil liberties. So this should be a fun conversation. I'm very much looking forward to it. To start off with, I would say that the reason I'm involved in these sort of issues is because my former professional background. I started my working life as an intelligence officer in MI5 before resigning to help blow the whistle on a series of problems and crimes that I and my former partner experienced on the inside of British intelligence. Because of doing that, we automatically broke the law, the Official Secrets Act, and we fled to Europe and lived in hiding for a year, lived in exile for another 2 years, and went through 2 major court cases. And during that time, we were very conscious of the fact that we were being surveyed, we were being watched. And that included not only our telephone calls and our emails, but also potentially within the privacy of our own home, which did not exist any longer. So I became very sensitive to why privacy matters so much to people. And if you don't have it, you can't freely think, you can't freely talk, you can't freely associate, you can't freely love. It becomes very, very corrosive to the human spirit, which is why I've become a privacy activist, as well as speaking out around a whole range of different issues around intelligence and international politics. But enough of me. Silkie, please introduce yourself and why you are passionate and why you do this work about privacy.
Thanks, Annie. Well, yes, I'm the director of Big Brother Watch, a privacy and civil liberties organisation. And I came into this area of activism. I think I was quite politically active growing up. One of the pivotal kind of life moments for me was going to Auschwitz with the Holocaust Educational Trust. And that's when I started learning more about human rights as a teenager. And I think growing up in the post 9/11 years as well, when there was a dramatic loss of civil liberties, like any vigilant citizen, I became anxious about the kind of future that I would have and that we would have as a country. And learning about, I think the other thing about growing up during the 9/11 era is, you know, we were very conscious of state crimes. And your story, Annie, and what you went through and witnessed and experienced was definitely formative. And also getting to know you and learning from you over the past decade has been really formative, completely formative in the life decisions that I've made and the campaigning that I've chosen to do. And then, of course, Snowden blowing the whistle in 2013 changed everything and changed the landscape, I think, of human rights organizations in the US and the UK and around the world. And that's why I think it's such a privilege to work on privacy and surveillance issues at a time when we're going through a technological revolution. These issues are at the core of so many of the rights struggles right now.
I would totally agree. I mean, I see this almost as an evolutionary step for humanity, particularly this year, because we've been forced pretty much to live our lives online. But just going back, yes, I think you're right. We did meet a decade ago, and I've got a feeling it was at this secret garden party. And then my big talk was all about how states slide into being police states and totalitarian states and things like that. Because after, as you mentioned, after 9/11, when the war on terror started, a lot of rights were being taken away. But most people didn't really recognize those rights because that was all happening actually largely abroad, and you know, it didn't really affect most people in the UK or the US or mainland Europe. So I might have come across as a bit of a sort of paranoid conspiracy theorist at that time, saying the UK is sliding into a police state. because of all these laws that have been put in place since 9/11. But now I'm just finding it increasingly frightening about what's going on around COVID. So the war on terror, created a wonderful opportunity for a power grab for the state and for the spies. But now we're seeing even more of a power grab about COVID. Could you tell me a little bit more about what you've been doing with Big Brother Watch around this?
Yeah, and by the way, you didn't come across like that to me. You came across like a breath of fresh air. One of the most intelligent and insightful people that I'd seen speak at the Secret Garden party. Yeah, I mean, and you were completely right. So many of the things that you and others had warned about. I mean, Glenn Greenwald as well. I remember Glenn Greenwald writing about mass surveillance before he got the Snowden disclosures. So yeah, there are lots of people who were, raising the alarm bells, and I think that's the job of human rights campaigners as a whole, is to keep raising the alarm. Unfortunately, sometimes the kind of a critical mass of awareness only emerges when it's too late, and we've got to make sure that's not the case now. Certainly, with after. In the wake of coronavirus, we are seeing a civil liberties landslide and a digital coup as well. And there has been very, very, very little of this in the mainstream press. I expect people are at capacity. It's, going through a pandemic is unlike anything that we've been through, but unfortunately, these issues are going without the scrutiny that they deserve. We're producing monthly reports, which anyone can find on our website, about the UK's response. We're looking at anything from, everyone's aware of the massive extension of police powers. Even the former Supreme Court Justice said that we're living in what looks very much like a police state. Police have become detached from the rule of law. Politicians don't understand the laws often that they're imposing by decree. In terms of surveillance, we've seen all the things that we warned about over the past decade, the small steps and encroachment of the surveillance state, whether it's automated number plate recognition or the millions of CCTV cameras that we have that are now being repurposed in new ways, or GPS tracking, electronic surveillance, drone surveillance, you name it. It's all been repurposed to criminalize people during this period at a time when, people really need support. A lot of blame has been individualized, and the surveillance state has been turned against citizens, which is the ultimate fear, I think, of any privacy activist. At the same time, as you said, we're now all living our lives online. So, Google Classroom owns the education infrastructure. Internet service providers know everything that we're doing, thinking, feeling, particularly because of the Investigatory Powers Act, meaning that we now leave internet connection, what they call internet connection records, that are available for pretty much any authority to dip into. And we have this kind of digital coup where, in particular, AI companies, but also the likes of Palantir, Microsoft, Amazon, etc., have gotten into the infrastructure of the state. The NHS, for example, we now have what's called the COVID-19 data store, which is run by Palantir, and has Amazon and Microsoft involved, which is a massive population level data store that was initially came into place because it was going to be a part of a temporary COVID solution. And actually is now openly a multi-year kind of regeneration of a digital NHS. And they, in their contracts, which they fought to keep secret, we can see that all kinds of data, ethnicity, political opinions, religion, location data, all kinds of different types of data can be sought and used and processed by Palantir. We've got AI and machine learning all over the place. I mean, it's actually too much for civil society to keep up with. But everyone needs to be aware anyway that there's a massive, the huge pace of change, enormous risks, and ultimately this is disempowering for the average citizen.
I think that's the problem, isn't it?
Yes.
It's too big an idea, so people just think, oh, I'm just going to use my phone, I'm just going to use my computer, and don't care. But it's interesting. You mentioned a point about the corporations infiltrating the state, and since Edward Snowden, and even before that, I've been talking about the state infiltrating the corporations. This is sort of terrible symbiosis going on between both sides of the argument that leads to mass endemic surveillance. I mean, I think this is probably a bastardized quote from Mussolini, the Italian dictator during the Second World War, that the merger of the corporate and the state is what fascism is, something like that. So it's interesting that you see it now, it's the corporate going into the state, whereas I've been talking about the state going to the corporate for a long, long time. But either way, it's bad. So for everyone sitting there thinking, what can I do against this? It's just too big a problem. Why should they care? What are the key fundamental points would you highlight?
It's a really good question, and a question I'm going to ask you as well, because I don't know. There is no one, there is no answer. The important thing is that we're all seeking the answer, that we're all seeking to bring about change and inform ourselves of what's actually going on in this moment, which is one of the one of the greatest stresses that modern society has been through. And I think certainly the role of NGOs and journalists in uncovering some of what is going on in behind closed doors and in deals between government and corporations, the repurposing of surveillance architecture, etc. I mean, this is stuff that needs to be brought to light and it needs to be discussed. I mean, even democratic processes that aren't really being discussed, the fact that most of the restrictions and laws that we're now living under, certainly in the UK, have been by decree. And that includes a lot of things that touch on privacy as well. Police now getting access to test and trace data, the obligation to use either a contact tracing app or give your personal details when you go into any kind of business, although they're all closed at the moment. But again, that's been imposed by decree under the pretense of urgency. I mean, the parliamentary process has been deliberately evaded. These are really, really serious things that if we're to remain a democracy, we have to be holding the government's feet to the fire on this. But I think another thing that's a bit disturbing, and I mean, you and I have spoken about this before, is I think there's in terms of what individual people can do, I am concerned about a spiral of silence that exists in society as well. This is certainly something that's happened in other countries and in other periods of time when there's been a kind of democratic decline, is that people become afraid to almost voice it to each other. And I don't know if you're experiencing that, but I am worried that that's the case. And I'm also worried that there is much more concern amongst the general public than is probably reflected in the media about this. Would you say? And also, you may have better I actually skirted the question of maybe what we can do, so I think you might have a better response to that.
Well, I mean, we've been talking about why privacy is necessary for years, and certainly being part of the sort of more geeky end of activism, have been very aware of the threats to our online rights. And I think there's definitely a need for people to stop thinking about digital rights, but actually just think about their human rights, both in real life and online. So some of the provisions, I think, that we can't trust our governments at all to ensure that we have privacy, and we can't trust the corporations to ensure we have privacy. And the government can't even hold most of the corporations to account because they're huge globalized monsters. So therefore, the only option for us, we the concerned citizen, to ensure our privacy is to take matters into our own hand. And I remember you wrote a wonderful book a few years ago. It was actually aimed at journalists. I think it was called InfoSec for journalists, Information Security for Journalists, on how to protect yourself online and also protect your sources. And I think those sort of steps that you recommended, some of them are still very applicable. Others might be slightly outdated now, and we need to move ahead and rethink. But could you just run down the list of the recommendations you gave?
Yes. So I co-authored a book in 2014 called Information Security for Journalists, which was a kind of thought experiment about, imagine you have a whistleblower like you, Annie, you know, someone who needs to give a journalist information. How on earth do you do it in this web of pervasive surveillance without leaving a trace? It's nigh on impossible. And so we looked at everything from everyday privacy to the kind of highest level, like you would want in that circumstance. Things have changed a lot since then. Some of the basic recommendations that we had were about using encrypted messengers, kind of accepting, I suppose most people have a smartphone. There's a limit, also acknowledging there's a limited amount of privacy you can have using a smartphone, but since we all use them, ultimately, yeah. I mean, if you're under, especially if you're under directed surveillance, there's nothing you can do to protect a phone. But using Signal, for example, an open source end-to-end encrypted messenger, we looked at email providers. A lot of that's changed, unfortunately. Things are getting harder and things are changing all the time. But I think the fact that over the past few weeks, millions more people have joined Signal and left WhatsApp, which is now owned by Facebook, and introduced these new, quite hostile terms and conditions for data sharing. And I think there is some hope there. You know, if you and I had said, 3-4 years ago, even that Signal would be like a widely used everyday app, I think we would have laughed. And so often you feel like, this hill is too difficult to climb, but at least in many cases there is growing consciousness of the importance of, exactly as you say, taking things into our own hands, and protecting our privacy ourselves.
What else can we do? I mean, we can't trust the state. I mean, I've certainly known this since the 1990s when I went on the run with David Shayler. I mean, even back then, and that was a relatively analog era, we knew that mobile phones could record us remotely. We knew that computers, of course, were completely vulnerable and all that sort of thing. And that was actually very labor intensive for the spies to do, to try and track us. But now, of course, we know that a flick of a switch, everything can be gathered up online. And we know this not just from Snowden, but also from the whistleblowing of many other brave NSA whistleblowers, people like Bill Binney, who was the technical director, Tom Drake, Kirk Wiebe, people like that. So there is this huge amount of information that's out there showing how we are vulnerable on the internet. And these people have been very clear about why we need to protect our privacy. And most of them do refer back to the fundamental human right enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in 1948. Privacy is essential because if you don't have privacy, then all citizens can be monitored. They can't freely operate as citizens. They just become subjects to a police state or a totalitarian state, which is why it's such a fundamental human right, in my view.
Yeah, I was wondering, given your completely unique experience of living under that directed surveillance, do you think, I mean, so you have that experience of what that does to your behavior, your sense of self, your ability to express yourself. It's an enormously stressful position to be in, I imagine. Now everyone lives with far more, it's almost like having an open window into your private life. I mean, especially for people in their early 20s or their teenage years, because there's an expectation to have your life on show, and that everything, that you're leaving data trails everywhere. You're kind of used to having automated suggestions for what you're thinking about, for example. They're two really different scenarios, of course, but what, from your experience, do you think that there will be this age of surveillance will lead to behavioral change, self-censorship? What does it do to a person's psyche?
I think we're already beginning to see a change in people's psyches, because there are reports about mental distress because you've got to be perfect online and present this perfect life. But in terms of being watched, I think it's become an expectation that you want to be watched. It's almost like people are being bribed into exposing more of their private lives, because then they might get rewards. You know, they become an influencer, they can make money out of it, they can travel the world and all that sort of stuff. I saw this trend start, I think it was back in 2000, I think, when there was that TV show Big Brother. And the idea was you shoved a bunch of people into a house and they were surveyed 24/7. And the one that came out the winner got not that much money, I think it's about 70,000 or something, changed their lives. And then they would go on to become a celebrity. And I remember saying, even back then, this is like training rats in a maze to want to be surveyed, because it provides bonuses, it provides rewards and all that sort of stuff. So that's 20 years ago. What we're seeing now with this social media idea, with this idea that you don't exist unless you have certain social media outlets. And if you have successful social media outlets, then you can become famous and become rich and all that sort of thing. It seems like a sort of psyop in training the future development of digital citizens, I suppose, because this is the first generation that's grown up not knowing this sort of tech. I mean, I remember sitting back in 2007, I'm old, the old friend, watching something, it was a TED talk about screens where you could move icons around and things like that. It was revolutionary. Now we all have that in our pockets. And people are aware that I keep wanting to say spy phones, iPhones and things like that are going to watch you, but the convenience is too great. So there is that mental shift, I think. And I find it very worrying, because that's going to mean that actually the hard-won rights and laws that were put in place last century are just going to be given up for frivolous reasons. And that's what I find frightening. And as we move our lives increasingly online, as I said earlier, I think it's an evolutionary step in terms of we've had to do it over the last year because of COVID. So it's a necessity rather than a choice. And we've had all this grooming before, that we are going to lose any sense of privacy. And as the tech accelerates, I mean, you know, people like Elon Musk are talking about neural laces or something like that, you know, plugging into your head. That's really frightening.
Yeah,
because then it goes back to the idea of who's going to own the hardware in your head, who's going to own your thoughts, who's going to own, you know, where it's stored. Anything could happen to what's going on. And I think that's really, really, really frightening.
Yeah, I think freedom of thought is one of the rights that at the moment is quite undiscussed in the privacy sector, but that we are going to have to deal with very quickly because of some of the new technologies on the horizon. This must be like the scale of surveillance and self-surveillance that we're talking about. Do you think this is like a dream for intelligence agencies, or is it just all noise?
I think a bit of both. Certainly, we know that back in the late 1990s, the NSA and GCHQ saw an opportunity. They wanted total mastery of the internet. So they really went for it. And this is one of the things that Bill Binney from the NSA disclosed. And they've won it effectively. And a lot of very good hacktivists and hackers did put up a very robust pushback against this. But I think they also recognize they probably lost the majority of the battle technologically. And then, of course, we have this cultural grooming that's been going on that we've just talked about. So I think that's definitely an issue. For the intelligence agencies, it is a bean feast. I mean, they just get all this information and they can do whatever they want with it. The obvious side of that, of course, is that because they have all this information, they keep missing the key information. And, you know, all... isn't it? And so all this information is sort of sitting there, most of it not looked at. But if, for example, in the future laws change, so you and I suddenly, as privacy activists, become domestic extremists or something like that, they can go back and pick through all our stored information, and we would therefore, in the future, potentially be at risk. But we also have the idea that they are losing the key information to do their job at the moment, which is preemptively stop things like terrorist atrocities. And we've seen this time and time and time again across Europe, not just the UK or the US, over the last 5 or 6 years with ISIS attacks, you know, things like the lorry, you know, massacres and things like that. All these people have already shown up on the security radar because of this endemic surveillance. And none of them were dealt with appropriately or in a timely fashion. So because the spies, for example, are swimming in all this information, they can't do their job effectively and protect us. So what's their point? It's just...
And Bill Binney is speaking at the conference, isn't he?
Hopefully, yes.
I'm sure I saw him on the. So Bill Binney is one of the most.
Definitely speaking at the conference.
Bill Binney and Tom Drake are they're. For anyone who hasn't heard about their story yet, then I really, really hope you will at the conference, and their stories are enmeshed, as you'll see. They have the most incredible experience to share about that from their time in the NSA, and that was also speaking to them. And I wrote an article about their about basically what they had left the NSA and blew the whistle on, and that was also very, very formative for me in terms of realizing the importance of this campaigning as well. The hunger, the kind of almost psychopathic hunger that they experienced in the NSA for mass data, and how counterproductive that was for people's safety, is shocking. And what happened at the end of their careers at the NSA was completely shocking. So yeah, I really hope that it will be fascinating to hear their reflections on the current state of play as well.
I think the most shocking thing was what happened to Tom Drake, because he went through all the appropriate channels when he had ethical concerns, up to and including a congressional hearing of the US Congress. And then he was threatened with 35 years in prison, and his home was raided by a FBI SWAT team. Hang on, so you do everything right as a potential whistleblower, and then you are still going to be penalized and chucked into prison. It's a shocker. So yes, he's definitely one of our speakers, and one I'm very much looking forward to hearing. He's become, should we say, expectedly very politicized since that happened to him. So he's a very powerful speaker. I think you met quite a lot of these people, didn't you, at various Sam Adams Awards, I think in Oxford and Berlin over the years?
Yes. Can you tell people about the Sam Adams Awards, and also, of course, the fact that you are the recipient of the award this year? Don't blush.
Okay, humble brag. No, so the Sam Adams Award was set up by a guy called Ray McGovern, who's a former very senior CIA officer, also a speaker at the forum in March. And he set it up in tribute to a friend who wanted to speak out against the Vietnam War and didn't, and regretted it ever afterwards. And then we give an award. We have been giving awards since 2004 to people who display integrity in intelligence. And the award's gone to an amazing array of people, such as Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Tom Drake, Bill Binney, and various other people over the years. Also Dr. Tom Finger, who single-handedly stopped a rush to war against Iran in 2008. So it's not just about whistleblowers, it's about people who display integrity. And I am incredibly honoured to be given that award this year. Not so much for the old whistleblowing stuff I did 25 years ago, but for my advocacy over the last decade, certainly, in support of whistleblowers and freedoms and things like that. So yeah, thank you.
Incredibly well deserved. And yeah, this Sam Adams Associates is an incredible group of people. And just as you were saying about how Tom Drake has been quite politicized after leaving the NSA, one of the things I love about all the Sam Adams Associates is that everyone, and it's like a collection of some of the most intelligent, interesting, and radical people. And I think it must be that going through that experience and having the courage to stand up and speak truth to the most awesome powers in the world, that takes a type of courage that is really completely unique and incredibly rare. And so having the opportunity to hear from people with that bravery is incredible.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the time, and we seem to be up to 30 minutes. Should we do a couple of questions, or do you want to carry on chatting for, say, another 10 minutes or something?
I'd be interested to see if we have any questions coming through. I'm looking at the chat. Okay, here's one. What is the best way to educate people about privacy? And Annie, you've been trying to do this. You have been doing this for a long time, as you keep saying. What, in your experience, has been the best way to educate people about privacy?
I find the best way is to personalize it. So just mentioning that sort of MI5, whistleblowing, what it was like to live like that. Not being able even to have a good gossip with my mum on the phone or something like that, because I was so paranoid. And or talk to your friends or read stuff or look at stuff on the computer because you think you might be watched or monitored and it's being logged what you've looked at. I think that personal aspect put into a sort of bigger picture is the most effective. But obviously not effective enough. I think probably the most effective thing that's happened recently is the WhatsApp thing, with terms and conditions changed and everyone got really upset about it. And serves them right, because they've been a bit rubbish, actually, over the last few years. So,
yeah. And so I think
it's either the economic or the personal.
And that could probably only have happened in the context of the post-Cambridge Analytica scandal, as it was called. But what was fascinating about it is that, I mean, the whole Cambridge Analytica story was really was storytelling about a business model that privacy campaigners like us had been warning about for quite some time. There wasn't really much of a scandal element about it above and beyond just the day-to-day machinations of Facebook. But it does seem to have risen consciousness about privacy in a way that does now make people's ears prick up when they see, oh, my terms and conditions have changed, Facebook wants more information from me. So I guess that's a good thing. I mean, I also find, I don't have a compelling story to tell like you, but in terms of personalizing, when we were able to go out, I used to run crypto parties, which are as fun as they sound. We basically would meet up in a bar and have really interesting privacy campaigners and speakers and trainers come together and give people free hands-on advice. And one of the things that would just trigger like behavioral change in someone instantly is if you take them through, say, an area on the smartphone where all your location data is tracked, and or you go through really boring but like Google privacy settings or Facebook privacy settings, and people can suddenly see, I think when they kind of look in the mirror of the data trail that they've left, then that can be quite, that can be like a real moment when it becomes personal, and then it suddenly matters.
I think those crypto parties were great, because it was just a sort of movement, wasn't it, where people with the skills would go out and say, I'm going to hold one and I'll just offer it for free and this expertise, and people could come along and learn how to protect themselves. That was a wonderful thing you did. It's such a shame that the tech sort of beginning to sort of outpace those particular tools at the moment, but yeah,
it's getting harder and harder, I think, to find good privacy tools, but also that there is now a market for them. I mean, Signal being as popular as it is a good reflection on that. What we really could do with is some better hardware, I think, as well. There are no good phones from a privacy perspective, and I think there's much more that could be done there. But we have another question.
I was going to say there are a couple of good phones. Unfortunately, they're hugely expensive. So it'd be nice if the price could come down and normal people could afford to have privacy. That would be good.
Yes, yeah. Another question has come through. I feel that if they, whoever that is, really want my information, they will be able to get it. Are we just trying to make it more difficult for them, or can we realistically keep our data private? I think the questioner here, when they refer to they, this is a category that in your past, Annie, you were in. So if they, I'm guessing they mean intelligence agencies, maybe big corporations, want information, they can get it. So what are we trying to do? Are we trying to make it more difficult, or are we seriously trying to keep our data completely private?
I think there's 2 points to that. One is I would always see the threats to our privacy online. It's the state actors if they deem you to be a threat. There's the corporations who are using us as commodities and just monetizing our data. And there's the criminals as well. Let's not forget them, the ones who want to buy up and use our data in that way. So there is an issue here of do we want to protect ourselves against the corporations and the state, which are very interlinked now? We know this from Snowden, where it's shown that all the major tech companies had backdoors, wittingly or unwittingly, from the NSA and from GCHQ. So those two are very, very complicit. We also know as well from things like the leak from the NSA in America of all their cyber weapons, which fell into criminal hands. And those cyber weapons were then sold on the dark web, and those cyber weapons have been mutated. I mean, one of the most notorious cases was the WannaCry ransomware that infected a lot of the NHS a few years ago. So there is an overlap between all three of these, I don't want to call them predators, but groups that might be part of they. And so we need to not necessarily just be paranoid about the spies or by the police, but also the corporations and the criminals. Definitely we need to protect ourselves against. And the overlap is making it increasingly difficult, I would suggest. But what's your opinion on this?
I agree. I agree with what you said. I think also, I think it depends in terms of, I completely agree with you about the kind of matrix of the threats. In terms of what individuals can do to protect themselves, I think it depends on your own threat model or your own kind of risk exposure, and then adopting behaviors that don't make you exhausted and make your life too difficult, but that give you the amount of privacy that you need. One of the things that I encountered doing information security training with journalists is that it could be very easy for people to want to have total security and total privacy. Of course you do, but it's not realistic or sustainable. And I think you could dig yourself into a hole by trying to be like James Bond all the time, or like you, Annie. I think it's different if you're, unfortunately, perhaps for yourself, certainly for people who've blown the whistle more recently, like Ed Snowden and others, people, and even campaigners, organizers who are at risk, activists, etc. The need and the urgency to protect your communications at a really high level, especially when others are involved as well. If you have other, like your network, your activist network and so on, if their information is at stake, you have to take it really, really seriously, and life might be uncomfortable for some of the ways that you have to operate. But I suppose it's knowing when to switch that on and then when to switch that off, so that life doesn't become too difficult to lead. And a lot of, for example, at Big Brother Watch, a lot of the investigations that we do, they might be sensitive, but we're going to publish them, within a day or two. If we were working on something longer term or something particularly sensitive, then we might work it, we'd work in a different way to the way that we'd work if we're going to have a quick turnaround. So I think it depends on a case-by-case basis to some degree.
Yes. Who you're working with and things like that. So the threat does go up and down. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So we have one more question, which is, it's sometimes argued that if you have nothing to hide, there isn't a privacy issue. Is there any truth to this? Annie, I know you would have been asked this about 6 trillion times, but I mean, it is a really important question as well, because it's the interminable question. It's the kind of mental barrier for a lot of ordinary people about whether they should care or not. So what's your best response to nothing to hide, nothing to fear?
I think I have 2, and one is definitely from Tom Drake, when he was asked this, and he said, well, if you've got nothing to hide, give me the keys to your house, give me the keys to your car, give me all your passwords on your computer, access to your finances, access to your medical records, and then how do you feel about privacy? Or are you on Tinder? That sort of stuff. Just people want to keep things to themselves, and to hand over all that stuff physically is quite a strong disincentive to wanting to hand over your privacy online, which is why human rights are human rights online too. One of the ways I used to counter this when I was doing talks is a lesser known Edward Snowden disclosure. And it was about an operation called Optic Nerve. And this was where the spies could in real time watch video conference calls. And it turned out that about 10% of them are actually fairly sexual in content, should we say. I mean, in this era of what used to be the era of long distance relationships, when we were flying around for work and doing all this stuff, you might want to have a sort of intimate moment with your partner who's in a different country, and that would be picked up. So you probably, it's consensual, not a problem, but you probably want to keep that private, for example. And I think that actual argument now is probably stronger because of COVID, and we've had to move our lives online, including relationships, including budding new relationships. And if you think about it, if all of that stuff, and we know all of that stuff is being hoovered up and stored, if not actively watched at this point, then that would definitely be a deterrent for me to, do stuff like that online. This is why it's so important to have privacy online, because if it goes down to that sort of degree of intrusion into a very personal side of your life, and that can be applied to all the other sides of your life too, I think most of us would be very frightened. I don't want to give my health records over. I don't want to hand over my financial records. I don't want to conduct a relationship online, knowing that it can be hoovered up like that. And I think this is probably the key point, as COVID has forced us all to live online, where we need to start thinking about this seriously. So,
I completely agree. I completely agree. And actually, Optic Nerve is the GCHQ program that I would raise when I used to have to argue with the spooks during the passage of the Investigatory Powers Bill, which is now an act, when they would try to convince at conferences or talks or in policy meetings, they would convince us that the agencies had a really perfect track record of only using mass surveillance powers as they were necessary and proportionate, etc. And no one could ever defend. Of course, there was neither confirm nor deny, but no one could ever give a convincing explanation of why you would take screenshots of well over 1 million people's webcam calls who weren't even targets. And one of the things I find quite interesting that has come from that and the post-Snowden years is that many of us, as I have now, in fact, we make Big Brother Watch webcam covers. We have covers over our cameras on our laptops and for me as well on our phones. This is a symbol, if needed, that there is like a silent consensus that we don't really trust some of the technology providers and even our own governments not to spy on us. And in fact, as exactly you said,
that's my cover, but yeah.
I think everyone should have one, and that feeling of even there being a slim possibility of not being private in your own home with cameras and microphones that are embedded into our technology that can be activated. Mm-hmm. I mean, even I want to get it right. I think it was. I'm actually not going to say because I forgot which company it was. It was a smart fire alarm that was found from one of the major companies that was found to have embedded in it a secret microphone that wasn't disclosed on the packaging and wasn't disclosed to customers. So yeah, I think we have to be, really vigilant about this. But I think, nothing to hide, nothing to fear is the kind of retort that we sometimes still come up against. I completely agree, asking people for their email passwords or, leaving we don't even leave our curtains open 24/7. We all are using our privacy day to day. But I think it's important for us to acknowledge as well that privacy is not just a kind of abstract right over snippets of data. It's really about power and the balance of power between the citizen and the state, and now corporations as well. And it's about freedom and it's about equality, and it's foundational for so many other rights, whether it's freedom of information, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, the right to be free from discrimination. even freedom of thought, as we were saying earlier as well, about in light of the direction of some of the technological development. And so if we want to have a free future, we have to protect privacy now. It's also quite unique, right, in that I think once the horse is bolted, it's very difficult to get it back. It's very difficult to reclaim privacy once it's lost. And China is really probably a blueprint for that as well. I wrote a blog a year after the Snowden revelations, giving 10 reasons why I think a kind of 10-point takedown of the nothing to hide, nothing to fear mantra, which I posted on Twitter today, actually, as part of the Privacy to Me campaign, which it would be lovely for people to participate into. The responses to that are really interesting.
No, that's wonderful. I totally agree. I mean, if we don't have privacy, we're going to lose all the other rights. And by losing all the other rights, we will lose our democracy. That's the baseline for me. So we've trespassed far too long on your time. Thank you so much for all that. And I look forward to hearing you talk at the forum. Of course, this is the World Ethical Data Forum at online, of course, and that's going to be on the 17th to 19th of March this year. So please check out the website, worldethicaldataforum.org. And I hope that many of you will join us for that event. I'm very much looking forward to it. Thank you very much.